So we come from Opera Software in Norway. My name is Andreas Bovens. I lead the Opera Software's developer relations team, and David Storey is also here. David is Opera's chief web opener. And so we'll both be talking about stuff you can do with Opera and stuff, of course, that is relevant to web developers. So we will explain how you can support Opera well, and tips and tricks and so on, and the tools we have for you. So let's get started. As you see, there's a little stormtrooper who's looking out over the harbor of Oslo. He'll guide us through the slides. So first off, detecting Opera. For those of you who wonder, that's a dried apricot there. So if you wonder how to detect Opera, well, in fact, you shouldn't really try to detect Opera. What you should be doing is try to use media queries, viewport, object detection, and those kind of things in order to optimize your site for different browsers. Of course, it's better to try to optimize your CSS, that it works in different browsers rather than sniffing and trying to make a whitelist of browsers that are allowed on your site and blacklist others that are not allowed and things like that, because that's part of our job. So what we often see is that sites only allow, especially big banking sites and things like that, and they only allow a number of browsers in. And very often, Opera users are at a disadvantage because we're not on the whitelist. There's no good reason, because web technology, all the web technologies are supported actually in Opera. And so that's part of our job also to go out to those people and sort of try to contact them and try to work with them on opening up those sites. But if you really have to, say if you're making a tracking app or if you want to, for whatever reason, still need to sniff for Opera and give a certain optimized content or whatever, preferably not to block us, then the user agent string for Opera 10 is as follows. It's a little bit strange, as you can see, because we identify as Opera 9.8 version 10. Although it's Opera 10. The reason for that is because when we released an alpha version of Opera 10 in December of last year, so we started using it on sites, and we saw that a number of IIS-based sites were actually sort of the scripting environment there was only checking for the first number after the Opera word. And so what happened was that a number of those sites thought that Opera 10 was Opera 1, and very often you sort of have this if bigger than 4 type of cutoff point. And so they would say, oh, Opera is smaller than version 4. It's Opera 1, so we don't give you certain scripts or things like that. So a lot of sites were breaking. And so it's basically because we're the first browser to hit 10. So I expect IE will be next. In a couple of years, they'll probably see the same problem happening with IE. And we hope that they fix it then. But for the meantime, for the time being, so Opera 9.8 version 10, it is going to be, and so we expect that when we go to version 11 and so on, the version number will be updated and not the Opera 9.8 part. So that's frozen for now. Something else that is the part in between the brackets is not so relevant. It's quite standard actually. Something else to highlight is the Presto number. Presto is our rendering engine, so Firefox is Gecko and Safari has WebKit. And in case of Opera, it's Presto. It's our own rendering engine, so we made it ourselves. So the version number here is Presto 2.2.15. So you'll see that on all our products right now, mobile and desktop, we all use Presto, variants of Presto 2.2, and we're moving forward to releasing Presto, 2.3 is already out in our device SDK, and 2.4 will be coming soon in future versions. So in case of Mini, it's something similar. You see there, as I said, Presto 2.2 in the end. And so if you sniff for, basically, if you want to sniff or detect which, for standard support, you can actually, it's recommended that you look rather at the Presto number than at the Opera version number, because the Presto number will definitely give you a good idea of, okay, this is the rendering engine, because we deployed the same rendering engine across all our browsers, mobile and desktop. So it probably gives you a much better idea of the standard support in the browser if you sniff for Presto. But as I said, you shouldn't really sniff.
The previous slide, you
Yes.
have a slash between Presto and the version number.
Yes, that's correct. Good. I put that in there as a. Yeah. So this will be updated. So it will be all with a slash before.
With slash.
Yeah. So 9.7 beta is currently a bit exceptional, but with going to 10, 10 beta, which will come out soon, well, there will be a slash also there. Okay. Oh yeah, maybe also worth pointing out, Opera Mobile identifies itself there as Opera Mobi. That is also something that is different. So you can make a difference between, you can see the difference between the desktop and the mobile version. Another method, and that is also that also works pretty well, is if you just look for with JavaScript for window.opera. And if it's true, it's Opera. If it's false, it's not Opera. So that's something you can also use to detect if a browser is Opera or not, and adjust your scripts or whatever you want to do with it. So that's also an opportunity. So then David will continue talking about Opera Dragonfly, and then I continue with the rest of the talk.
Okay, how many people here know about Opera Dragonfly? Okay, not very many. Okay, Opera Dragonfly is our premier developer tool. So this is when, in the beginning of the web, when most people made websites that were fairly static. They were just HTML pages, a few CSS. But these days, we're moving more to advanced applications using Ajax and JavaScript and making full applications. So it's very hard to debug websites just by using the alert dialog or things like that. So we found out through a lot of people like Yahoo that it was too hard to develop for Opera because there was no tools available. So we decided to make Opera Dragonfly, which is a fully fledged tool. It's fairly similar to things like Firebug or Web Inspector and WebKit. So it has basically it has things like a full JavaScript debugger. It has CSS inspector, DOM inspector, error console, and in Opera 10 we've just introduced a network inspector. This is fairly early in development, so we're still in the alpha phase, but we're hoping to move forward fairly fast. An issue we've had with developing this is that we had to start from the ground up with infrastructure to allow debugging. So this is an issue because obviously we can iterate slightly slower because we have to develop this as time goes by, but it gives us a huge advantage in that we can start with a modern infrastructure, which other browsers don't have. So this is actually built directly into our browser. You don't have to download an extension like Firebug, and you just go to Tools, Advanced, and Developer Tools in the browser's file menu. This is a screenshot of the application, and we'll show you a quick demo of this. So here it is loading. It's basically the architecture is it's a web application, so you never have to download a new version. It just fetches the newest version from the server. So we're always on the latest version. We don't have any dependencies on old browsers, which will break. Here we have the Yahoo homepage, and we have the DOM inspector open. So we can find an element. Andreas here is on the body element, so he's going to click on this and edit the CSS. So here he's setting the background color, and as you can see, it's turned to red. And you can press the up and down button, and it will cycle through all the different valid values. You can also, for instance, edit the DOM. So if he goes to somewhere, an element like, can you just delete an element or delete the form? Or I'm not actually sure what you quite edited there, but there you can see all the code just disappeared live editing. As he types, it will appear or disappear. Can you go to the network inspector?
Yep.
So here it's in cache, so only the first page loads. But as he reloads, you'll see all the elements, how long they take, the total time of the page, if there's errors, the error code, all the information from the methods, things like that. You can have the raw request, or you can have a summary of all the HTTP headers. We also have the error console, which is the standard error console with collapsed errors, where you can see all the errors. This actually shows the things Opera sees internally. So it will show an error if you're using, say, a CSS property that Opera doesn't support. So many of these there's many things like IE hacks. You'll see there's a margin bottom there. It's actually a IE hack, which isn't valid, but it's showing up as an error here. Okay. And the reason why it was important we built a new infrastructure with the scope protocol was it allows us to do very advanced things. Like one of the biggest, most important things about Opera Dragonfly is Opera is on many devices, so it's very important to us that you have a first-class experience debugging mobile devices. So here we have this girl which decided to do remote debugging, but she didn't quite understand it and went to a remote location in Norway instead. So remote debugging is actually fairly simple. You go to the settings menu and you can click remote debugging on and it will set a port number. You then go to opera:/debug in the device and you will type in the IP address of your local machine. It then can communicate through what we call the scope protocol, which either works in XML, JSON, or Google protocol buffers. And as you manipulate the device, it will send all their interaction back to your desktop browser. So you can do the same thing as we showed with editing the DOM, changing the CSS, and things like that. We also have the Opera debug menu. This is similar to things like the web developer toolbar in Firefox. It lets you manipulate the page, show outlines, and things like that. This can be downloaded from opera.com/dragonfly. There's a link on the page, and you can just download it. It adds an extra menu. For instance, here we're highlighting all the div elements, so you can see the layout of the page. There's also things like you can validate the page to CSS3, CSS 2.1. You can disable things, CSS, JavaScript. Basically everything we've got in the browser which is relevant to web developers. We have also got the documentation because we found that's useful that you can check the spec. You can do things like check if the page is in standards mode. And,
So will it generate XPath when you select a section of the web?
No, this is just for the specs at the moment. But if that's something you find useful, it's something we can build in. We're developing all the time. We're always looking for feedback for things that people want. So. If you go to viewports, check viewport size. This will show you the viewports. So this is very useful for testing mobile sites. Other things we have some more minor tools built into the browser. We have the info panel, and we have a reload from cache function. The info panel basically shows you all the information about the page, like the encoding and what scripts are there, so you can directly go to the scripts, all the CSS files, and basically all the resources of the page. Reload from cache is a very useful feature. We use this a lot in debugging. Basically, when you open the view source, it will show you all the source of the page like usual, but you can directly edit the page from the source. And when you click Apply Changes, it will directly apply the changes to the cache of your browser. So it's very useful for things like we remove the browser sniffing and see if the page works. So here, Andreas is just searching for some text that you can remove and change. Yeah.
Page reloads.
Yeah, so the pages reload here from the cache, and the code is removed is not in the page anymore. Things you should be aware of. We have the X-forwarded for HTTP header is something that's very useful to detect the location of where the user has came from. Usually people check the IP address to see if, say, people are in San Francisco or something like that. But with Opera, we have Opera Mini, which all the rendering is done on the server. In this case, if you check the IP address will be of the Oslo server. So if people go to something like Facebook, they often get the content in Norwegian, which obviously most people don't understand except for Norwegians. This is also going to be an issue for Opera Turbo, which is it's a similar technology we have for the desktop and mobile browser, which renders things on the server and compresses images and content to make sure that they're loaded faster on slow networks like Wi-Fi's at conferences, or if you live in a country where they don't have fast connections. So instead of connecting the IP address, there's a thing called exported for HTTP header. This relays the chain of IP addresses from the original location down to our server. So if you check for the original request, that will give you the IP address of the original user. Andreas will now talk you through things like the viewport meta tag.
Good. Who of you is familiar with the viewport meta tag that is used often on iPhone sites? A few people, not too many. Okay, good. Then I can tell you something. Maybe stick to this slide for a moment. So when the iPhone came out, Apple decided, so on the iPhone, as you know, web pages are shown in a sort of overview mode. So they're defaulted to about 980 pixels, and those 980 pixels are squeezed into 320 pixels. So you have a sort of small rendition of the page, and then you tap or you use this pinch movement to zoom in. That works fine for a lot of sites, but what Apple decided when they released the iPhone, so they said in the beginning there was no application platform, so people couldn't make apps, and said you should build your app on the web. So what they did was they made a meta tag that allows you to set arbitrary values for the width of the page. So they said instead of it defaulting to 980 and zooming everything out and everything being very tiny, that doesn't really work if you want to give your apps an application-like feel. So they said you can, for instance, say like, okay, load this page with a width of 320 pixels, 240, 480, and so on. And so this is set in the head section of the page, and I'll go through the markup later on. But so it allows you to set a certain width and zoom level for when pages are loaded. So, for instance, you see it on a lot of sites like Facebook. They made a special version, an iPhone-specific version of their site. Whether it's a good or bad thing, that's another question. I guess in some scenarios it makes sense when your site is really Ajax heavy, and you know that the experience is going to be not very good on mobile, and there's no way to rework everything. So you want to just ship it and make something optimized for the iPhone or for other mobile devices actually. So the viewport meta tag is often used, and so here this is an iPhone optimized version of Facebook. And so you see, in case you wouldn't support the iPhone this viewport meta tag, the page would look like this. So in fact, like that, squeezed down. And so with the meta tag, it looks like this, which is of course much better experience. So it's basically squeezed and nicely fit into one column. Opera also supports this, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it. Opera also supports this. Opera Mobile, in fact, supports this in 9.5 and 9.7. We will, of course, also continue supporting it in Opera Mobile 10. So you can use it. The tricky part, of course, is that in case of Opera, so we ship on many devices, and the iPhone is always 320 pixels wide, at least so far. Maybe they're working on a version with higher resolution. So what developers tend to do is they take this width is 320 and they set it fixed in pixels. So that gives you less flexibility if you start using this on different devices. So what we advise developers to do is to use width is device width. So then in case your screen is 480 pixels wide, it sets it to 480, and 240, 240, and so on. So you've got a lot of variety. That's very handy, for instance, on this phone, which has a little bit of strange resolution. And so I believe it's 340 pixels, which is a bit strange. So if you use that, then it fits nicely in the full screen.
Will it take percent of the device width?
No, it doesn't take percentages. So it's pixels or this variable. Yeah. But even if you set a smaller value, normally it will scale up so as to fit nicely in. But then your calculations become much more complicated because one pixel is not one pixel. One pixel might be 1.5 pixels and things like that. So the calculations become much more complicated.
This is for different devices, right?
Yes,
That
indeed.
device.
Yeah, indeed. So but Apple also themselves, they recommend it because, for instance, well, they have one device, but in fact, if you turn the iPhone on the side, it becomes, in a way, a different device because it gets a different width.
Exact same.
Yes, exactly. So, but that's what we want to highlight because we ship on more devices, and yeah, exactly. This for different phones, different environments. Also for Android, by the way. Android also ships on device with different resolutions, so makes sense there too. Then I'd like to say something about media queries. How many of you have heard about media queries? Or not? A couple? Okay, good. So we think that viewport combined with media queries actually can allow you to make a normal site into a cross-browser site, cross-platform site fairly easy. I'll quickly explain how it works. Quickly have a look at the time. Oh, we're still in time. So media queries are a CSS mechanism that allow you to apply certain style rules selectively, so connect them to a certain condition. And if this condition is fulfilled, you apply the style rule. So in this case, I say here, okay, if the max width of my if the width is maximum 256 pixels or everything smaller, apply a stroke width of 13 pixels. As you see, that's SVG specific CSS. I'll talk about that later on. And if the width of the page is 128 pixels, do yet something else, make the stroke width 15 pixels, and so on. So you can make fairly complex and sort of nicely alternating layouts with this kind of construct. So maybe that sounds very technical. I'll give you a quick demo of how this can work. So this is a page that uses media queries. It's a simple 3-column layout. If I resize it, you see that here that a two-column layout is triggered. If I resize it a bit more, imagine now this is the size of an iPhone approximately, 320 pixels wide. So then you see that this pops up, and this is one of my colleagues who pops up, if I make it even smaller. So it's just, so you can see that you can totally change the layout of the page. So I'm not changing the HTML, I'm just changing the style, of course. But it gives you a lot more flexibility than a classic liquid layout. It's always liquid versus fixed layout, but this actually gives you much more flexibility when it comes to page layouts. No, so this is also supported in Safari, and if I'm correct, also in Firefox. Is that 3.5 Firefox? Yeah. We are the only browser though that does the live sort of changing of the page. So with Safari, you have to drag the window, and I think reload. I'm not entirely sure. So it does this. It needs a refresh in order for the media query to be triggered. But this also works on the iPhone, by the way, and on Android, WebKit, and Opera as well. Of course, mobile as well. So, if I may here, so David and I went to SVG Open over the weekend, and so while listening to the conference at Google about scalable vector graphics, and I started hacking around a little bit. I had some fun with making some stuff. And so what I try to, so what I say, well, the point here is actually, so this maximum width that I just referenced or talked about refers to the viewport width of the page. So if you resize the page, this value changes. Now, let me.
Does it have max height?
Yeah, max height also works. Yep. So now, if you do this with SVG, you can do some fairly interesting stuff. So in this case, I've included, this is an SVG image that is included in the page with a simple image tag. And so this slider, I've connected it, I changed the attribute value, the width attribute value. And so if I change the slider here, you see that the image resizes. And now I've applied a media query here on the SVG file. So inside the SVG file, there's a media query. So if I resize this, you see that the colors are changing. So this is something also done with media queries. So that allows you. So it works. What I want, the point here is basically so that it doesn't only work with the whole browser window, but also with content that is like SVG, that is like XML, like you can understand media queries, and is included inside the page. So how this works, if it wasn't clear yet. So I have an HTML file and a reference and SVG image. I included with the image tag. And then you see here that I've got these widths defined, these max widths defined in the with media queries. And this max width refers to the width actually that I set there on the image tag. In this case 300, and then the media query for 300, maximum width of 300 will be applied. Let me show you a couple more demos. So this one is also interesting. So here I selectively turn off parts of the SVG of the SVG image. For instance, you see here that this little spiral here in the background, maybe it's not so visible, goes away, and I make the border a bit thicker. So you see that here the border is smaller. I make it a bit thicker so the original intent of the logo is better preserved. Make it even smaller, and then you see like a favicon like rendition pops up. So here it becomes something really hard to see what it is. But so I've optimized my image over different sizes and so on. So it can then be used, say, as a favicon, and at the same time use the same image in a page as a company logo. Here is another example. This is a chart that I grabbed from Wikipedia. So if I resize it, you see that I bump up the font size here on the left, and here it becomes really hard to read. So the media query here triggers, I'm sorry, let me go back. Here it triggers a sparkline rendition of the same image. So it's also done with CSS and media queries. So you see in this way your image can be optimized for several resolutions, several sizes basically.
The media query CSS3 specs.
Yes, indeed, that's correct. And so we're the only browser where media queries work with SVG images in this combination at this point, but we hope that others will do so soon as well. Okay, then vendor-specific CSS prefixes. So what we see is there's a lot of sort of competition between different browsers to include new parts of the CSS3 specification. And a lot of people are enthusiastic, they make demos, and then they say, for instance, okay, border radius is supported on Firefox, and then they do -mos border radius and WebKit border radius, and transitions are on WebKit right now. We'll have them soon as well. So then they write -WebKit -transition. Of course, if you load then those demos or those sites or whatever you use it for in Opera, it breaks because you use the vendor-specific prefix. So what we want to do, or what we want developers to do, and what we ask them to do, is basically to write this. You see that I made sure that the highlight there matches well the color of my sweater.
So is that going to be approved?
Yeah. So well, most likely it will be approved. It's in the process of standardization, pretty close to being a final, pretty stable spec actually. So if you say, for instance, MOS border radius, WebKit border radius, it's a good idea to also include just a generic border radius because that's what we will be supporting soon, and also other browsers, I guess, so that it sort of works in all browsers and not just in one. The same for transitions, for instance, there's WebKit transition. We will implement it with O transition, but also a generic transition CSS element is probably a good idea. CSS property is a good idea. Okay, then some funky demos. You see that our Stormtrooper is going crazy. Use SVG and web fonts in your designs. So we recently released Opera 10, and for that, to celebrate that, we made a couple of demos. So we have, these are web fonts. I don't know how many of you are familiar with web fonts, but so what web fonts does is instead of using, so far developers have basically been limited to using the fonts that are pre-installed on the computer. The page is rendered on. So this always is different from environment to environment. Now there's a little bit more standard, I think, than it used to be. But so with web fonts, it allows you basically to define a font in the CSS file and link it to a font in the server, on a server that a font where you have permission to use it in a web page. and then the web font is loaded, and it is applied straight on the page. So as you see, so this is not an image; it's selectable text. So you can make pretty cool layouts with this. In this case, it's sort of something that looks a bit like a newspaper. So you see, all this stuff would have been images before, but now it's you can do it as text as well.
So Firefox 2.5 supported with other,
Yes, yeah.
with other browsers.
Safari also supports it. Yeah. So this is another little demo that is quite nice. So also here the web fonts used. You see here we sort of use a terminal-like font, and it's transparency. So we support the HSLA and RGBA color models. So you can define, you can add an alpha channel basically to images, to colors you define in CSS. So this is another demo. Also here, maybe worth highlighting is content editable. So you can change the text. You can start typing here. So that's also something we support. And oh yeah, and not to forget, the backgrounds are actually SVG images. So you can put an SVG image as a background image, which is currently also only possible in Opera. And so therefore, so you have this little gradient here on top is done with SVG images, and I believe the buttons are SVG images as well. David made these demos, by the way. So this is a little book cover made in SVG and Smile. So you can also try to play with that if you're thinking of making some stuff or some cool demos in Opera. So this is also web fonts. You can combine SVG with web fonts. So all this stuff is selectable. Here's another demo. This is also all selectable text. As you can see, it's a web font applied and then projected on a spiral path. So we're very excited about this because you can see that there will be a lot. The web will be graphically and typographically much more interesting the next couple of years when all browsers support this. This is another example, a last example of SVG web fonts and SVG combined. So what I've done here, I've included web font in the page, and then I have applied an SVG filter on top of it. So you can see that the edges of the fonts are a little bit jagged. So that's not inside the font, but it's a filter that's applied afterwards. So no letter is the same. Basically, all of them are a little bit different. Gives a more natural sort of washed out look to the page.
Right. So it depends what you're trying to do. Canvas is an API. It's an API with pixels. So it exports. I think the native format is PNG, while SVG is a vector format. So if you're trying to do manipulating pixels, then Canvas will be more performant. SVG, if you're manipulating vectors, because everything's retained and you can interact with the DOM and you don't have to redraw things, the SVG will be more performant.
So
But
SVG text be more efficient than SVG.
yeah, usually text, SVG will be more efficient. The reason for that is it can be, because text is already kind of vectors because they're outlines and they can scale. The reason you'd also want to use SVG is because the text is in the DOM, so things like screen readers can access the text. Why, if you use Canvas, they're just pixels, so a blind person would get nothing. Okay. So one big problem with Opera we have in the US is with site compatibility. That's one of my main jobs, and the reason for this is big sites will say, well, Opera has less than 1% market share, we don't really care. But as we find out that this is really a myth, the 1% actually is not quite true. If you look into places like Europe, this is our core market for Opera. We've got about 7% market share in Europe. But if you look at the new EU member states, these are countries which have become part of the EU in the last few years. You'll see major markets like Poland, which is one of the biggest countries in Europe, already surpasses 12% market share in Opera. Places like Romania, 12%, Lithuania, 12%. Czech Republic, which is also one of the biggest countries in Europe, that's 9% market share. So if you don't support Opera, you're missing a huge part of the European market.
Does this include the cell phones or mobile?
This doesn't support mobile, this is only desktop. We'll get to that a bit later. We generally find Opera is bigger in places like Europe and the developing world because they often have slower computers and slower network access, and Opera is optimized for slow connections. It's got very good support for caching and things like that. If we look further into the Canada EU countries, these are becoming EU countries probably in the next 10 years. They're major growing markets. Places like Serbia have 10% market share. These, they have very little users at the moment on the internet because they're developing countries. But in places like Western Europe and America, the number of people on the internet is fairly static because the internet penetration is very high. If a browser gets new users, they're taking new users from other browsers. In places like Eastern Europe, the internet population is growing all the time. So these are all brand new users which are coming onto the internet. For major markets in Western Europe, Opera is not so high, but our major market there is Germany, which is the biggest country in Europe by population and by internet population. So 4% is a fair amount of market share. There's probably that's about 2 million users. But you see the biggest market for Europe is actually the former Soviet Union. If you look at Russia, we have 37% of the market. It's actually the biggest browser in Russia. If you go across the entire former Soviet Union, which is now called the CIS, like 40% in Kazakhstan, we have 44% in Ukraine, which is the second biggest market in the former Soviet Union. And also, if you look at the biggest developing markets in the world, there's a concept called BRIC, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and next 11, which is what Goldman Sachs says is the 11 biggest growing economies in the world. You'll see places like Bangladesh with 10% market share, Indonesia, which is the 5th biggest country in the world, that has 7% market share and growing. We probably have over 100% growth in Indonesia already this year. So that's becoming a major world power on the internet stage. You'll find countries in North America, South America are much lower. We only have about 1% market share there, which is the same as the US, but they're also growing very fast. For instance, Mexico, we've had about 60% growth already this year. What we also find was you have a network effect. Places like Russia, because they have a sphere of influence, that's why we grow big in one market like Russia, and we will grow big in the rest. You're starting to see this in Southeast Asia. It's not so strong because there's not one common language between countries, but because we grew big in Indonesia, we're starting to see places like Vietnam, Malaysia, places like that are also growing big. If we look into places in Africa, like Nigeria, 6% market share, all the areas around there are growing very fast, especially actually North Africa. North Africa is the biggest economies in Africa, and places like Egypt, 3%. And that's growing very fast. One of the biggest reasons for this is with mobile, we're very strong. We have partners like Vodafone, which is one of the biggest carriers in North Africa in the world. And because Opera has a big name on mobile, they know about Opera. If you ask somebody what Opera is, they will know what Opera is. So we have like a halo effect where they start using our desktop browser.
And also, I mean, I use Opera partly because I can synchronize my passwords.
Right.
I don't have to remember them.
Right, yeah. Opera Link, he was mentioning, is a way you can connect the desktop browser to the mobile browser to share things like passwords, bookmarks. So instead of having to type the URLs on your mobile device, you can enter it on the desktop and sync them across. For your 10 most popular sites, we have a thing called speed dial where you bookmark the 10 most favorite sites and it's just one click away instead of having the clunky text input. China's 0 because I actually rounded them to the nearest 1%, and China was 0.39 or something like that. China, it's good you pulled that up because East Asia, except for Japan, usually fairly low. The reason is IE has got a market dominance there, and websites often rely on things like IE bugs or ActiveX. So for instance, in South Korea, which is also 0, they use for security ActiveX to log into websites. The reason for that was during the Bill Clinton administration, they banned the export of 128-bit encryption because they said it was military-grade technology. Korea thought that was unacceptable because they want their secure system, so they rolled their own. But when they rolled their own, they decided to use ActiveX, so no browser will work in that market except for IE, basically. That was a big problem for them as well as us because when Vista rolled out, they blocked ActiveX. So half of the Korean web broke when Vista rolled in.
Back in the
which that obviously costs them billions of dollars. So don't design for browser bugs or browser-specific features, basically. If we move on to mobile, this is Opera's really highest strengths. For instance, Asia, we have 50% of the Asian market, and the Asian market is probably the biggest for mobile because often in those countries, the first time somebody goes online, they are using a mobile browser and not a desktop browser. This is mini and mobile, yes. These actually stats are from gs.statcounter.com. So, yeah, Africa, again, 57% of the market. This is mainly mini, and the reason, because obviously in Africa, they don't have expensive smartphones like the iPhone or Android. They have very basic phones. And Opera Mini gives the same class experience on a mobile, on a basic feature phone. South America, we also much higher. You've seen we only had 1% market share in South America for desktop, but on mobile, we have around 18%. Altogether, I think this works out to about 27% market share for Opera on mobile, which is higher than the iPhone. So that's it for the presentation, and we'll open the floor for questions.